Three things have crippled Western civilization. This is part 3, the loss of education and the new dark ages. From science and discovery to corporate greed and social justice. 25 years ago, the astrophysicist Carl Sagan said the following: "I have a foreboding of the world in my children's and grandchildren's time, when we are a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when people have lost the ability to set their own agenda and knowledgeably question those in authority, when, clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness." Carl Sagan, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Darkness. By understanding the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, we see many parallels with events today. The Roman Empire gave Western civilization 1,000 years of safety, prosperity, and relative peace. But people forgot the discipline, values, and sacrifices that made their society great. A series of weak leaders allowed corruption to grow, inequality soared, people turned away from lives of responsibility, knowledge, and self-control, and lived lives of pleasure and self-indulgence. Western civilization fell into 1,000 years of violence, poverty, and suffering. The Islamic world rose in a series of caliphates. As each caliphate sought knowledge from the outside world, it prospered. Each time they turned away from knowledge and turned inwards towards religious fundamentalism, they declined to be replaced or conquered by another civilization. In the 1300s, the Western world discovered the writings of an Islamic chap named Ibn Rushd, a polymath who regarded Aristotle as embodying the highest ideals of the human intellect. So profound and vast was Rushd's knowledge, the Western world was inspired to rediscover the wisdom of the ancient world, leading to hundreds of years of relentless scientific advancement, lifting the Western world out of ignorance and barbarity and towards the space age. Unfortunately, in the last 50 years, the Western world has once again turned away from science and discovery towards corporate greed and social activism. At the same time, corruption and inequality has exploded. The Second World War forced scientists to work night and day on incredible new technologies the world had never before seen. And this knowledge led to tremendous advances in medicine, engineering, computing, and all fields of life. When the war ended, this technology brought astonishing prosperity. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union went all out to achieve global dominance, invading country after country, killing and imprisoning hundreds of thousands, driving nations into poverty, and threatening nuclear war. Their deadly missile program forced the West to develop their own missiles or be conquered and subjugated like so many other East European and Asian countries. The space race began, with each side trying to outdo the other in rocket technology. The entire world dreaded the possibility of World War III. It was widely believed the nuclear war would end all life on Earth. During this time, the baby boomers came into the world. Their parents were tired and traumatized from war and simply wanted to rest. But the communists, having slowly infiltrated the Western world's universities, dripped anti-Western, pro-communist propaganda into young minds. Many of these students became school teachers, members of the education department, or government ministers. Gradually, they turned schools against the West. In turning against the West, students were encouraged to see all Western institutions, including science, as evil. In believing the entire history of the Western world was one of massacres and invasion, they turned towards arts degrees and away from science. A clear example of this is that in 1969, the silent generation was able to put people on the moon. From 1969 till 1972, there were 6 moon missions. Nobody has been to the moon since 1972, a period of 49 years. The moon mission brought staggering new technological advancements, from LASIK eye surgery to firefighting equipment to insulin pumps, saving millions of lives and dramatically improving people's quality of life. But as the universities decreed the West is evil, many Westerners turned away from science and discovery towards social causes, spiritual enlightenment, and self-fulfillment. Curiosity, daring, and adventure have been replaced by consumerism, self-adulation, and mental illness. Over the last 50 years, the Western world has seen the rise and rise and rise of consumerism. We've replaced 500 years of relentless scientific advancement with decades of mindless consumerism. The Western world has gone from exploring the planet, outer space, and the atom to exploring social media. Hundreds of millions of people are mentally ill, and millions are suicidal. The continual decline of the ability to reason, and the ability to understand logic, and the ability to understand facts, has led to the rise in workplace bullying, and the inability of workplace HR departments to separate fact from emotion, leading them to side with bullies against their victims. At the same time, the relentless deregulation and centralization of power led big business to adopt a greed at all costs mentality. Western society began to split in half. Some people turned away from materialism, others embraced it with a greed never seen before in history. Debt skyrocketed. Today's children will have to pay it back. The roots of modern political corruption began in 1933. Roosevelt signed the New Deal, which centralized power, allowing the government to build large-scale works to rebuild the economy after the Great Depression. Unfortunately, this made it easy for lobby groups to influence politicians, and corruption skyrocketed. Over time, American-style political corruption entered Australia. In 1939, the author Bruno Rizzi said in the book The Bureaucratization of the World, "A ruling class of government administrators and corporate managers is taking over. Bureaucracy is the emerging form of government everywhere. A monstrous world is being born, so evil that it is resurrecting slavery after 2,000 years of history. The planet will inevitably be dominated by 6 or 7 bureaucratic autocracies." In 1941, the author James Burnham says in The Managerial Revolution, "The major powers have fallen into the hands of a new elite. The managers, executors, financiers, and stockholders who own and run corporations, and the government administrators who regulate them. It's the corporate lobbyists who write the laws, who shape the policy and set the agenda." GDP and wages rose together until the 1970s, when big business totally infiltrated both sides of politics and the gap between the rich and poor exploded. In 1946, the sociologist C. Wright Mills found that big business executives in Atlanta, Georgia, earned a little more than twice as much as the town workers. In 2014, by contrast, the CEO of Caterpillar made 486 times as much money. Corruption by the rich and powerful caused the tech wreck of the 1990s and the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. In the 1990s, millions of people lost their savings when the tech bubble burst. In 1995, the former co-chairman of Goldman Sachs Bank, Robert Rubin, became Treasury Secretary and the Director of the National Economic Council. He was supposed to enforce laws from 1930 that stated before taking a company public and selling shares, that company must show 5 years of trading and at least 3 years of profitability. Rubin failed to enforce these rules, and Goldman Sachs advisors advised millions of people to buy shares that they knew were worthless. When the tech bubble burst, millions of people lost their savings, the rich made huge profits, and the perpetrators got a slap on the wrist. The 2008 housing crisis came after the 1933 Glass-Steagall Law, which separated commercial and investment banking, was repealed in 1999. Banks issued loans to millions of people
knowing full well that those people had no way of paying those loans back. Those loans were then sold to other people. When the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis happened, millions of people lost their savings, the rich became dramatically richer, and the perpetrators received a slap on the wrist.
Australian banks bought US subprime mortgages, knowing that if they failed, the Australian government would use taxpayers' money to bail them out, which they did.
During the recent pandemic, Australia's billionaires increased their wealth by 50%. Meanwhile, government debt skyrocketed. It is the taxpayers who will have to pay it back. We live in an age of blatant corruption by the ultra-rich, the ultra-powerful, and our politicians, because laws passed in previous generations, specifically designed to prevent corruption, have been repealed one after the other for the last few decades.
Grants, tax cuts, and favoritism towards big business meant that small companies couldn't compete. Corruption reached obscene levels. Today, Boeing Airlines faces fines of $2.5 billion for corruption. Their rival Airbus faces fines of $4 billion for corruption. 346 people died when the two Boeing Air Maxes crashed. This is because the regulator, who was supposed to regulate Boeing, was staffed by people from Boeing. So Boeing was regulating themselves. Boeing's corruption led to 346 deaths. Both of these companies have huge Australian operations, siphoning millions of dollars out of this country, because smaller Australian companies cannot compete with these corrupt giants. Almost every large corporation on earth has paid huge bribes to both sides of politics. Due to corruption, working class wages flattened in the 1970s and began to decline, factories closed and work went offshore, and the wealth gap became so obscene, 30 people owned half the wealth of the entire human race. Meanwhile, many young Australians will never be able to own their own home. In the second half of the 20th century, the modern family was torn apart. Australia had 6,600 divorces in 1960, but 49,000 by the year 2000. The rise in divorces and single-parent families directly correlated to a rise in violence, mental illness, rape, murder, a fall in education, a fall in civility, and the slow decline of Australian society. Science clearly shows that children raised by both parents grow up much happier, more prosperous, and far less likely to commit crimes than those denied both parents. Children from fatherless homes are 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 10 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 14 times more likely to commit rape. In Australia, 75% of all inmates are from fatherless homes. Mum's new boyfriend is the most dangerous man in a child's life in New South Wales. A step-parent is 17 times more likely to murder a child than a parent. Governments from both sides have tried to replace a father in the home with a government check. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men and women. So said the very great Frederick Douglass, the former slave, social reformer, abolitionist, writer, orator, and statesman. Since the 1970s, society has eroded dramatically. Therapists replaced friends, anti-anxiety medication use skyrocketed, huge numbers of children were medicated, most of the population became overweight or obese, and health declined dramatically. Today, IQ scores are declining for the first time in history, school grades have declined for decades, and today's parents may be the first generation to outlive their children. Many teenagers and even children are now presenting with diseases previously only found in the elderly. In 2018, suicide was the leading cause of death in Australian children under the age of 17, according to the government website, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Long-term thinking has largely been abandoned in favor of instant gratification. The inability to understand the consequences of poor life choices leads to higher violence, higher depression, higher drug use, and higher suicide. Meanwhile, Australia's political leaders plan for the next election. The Chinese plan for centuries. Science lifts all races and genders, but Western universities churn out radicalized social justice warriors, high on violence and light on facts. Malcolm X said the following: "White liberals pose as your friend, pose as your benefactor, pose as your employer, pose as your lawyer trying to help you. They infiltrate all your organizations, and in this manner they strangle your militant efforts towards freedom, justice, and equality." In America, BLM activists, mostly from privileged middle-class backgrounds and largely white, vandalized and destroyed black-owned businesses by the hundreds and destroyed black suburbs in the name of social justice. Nothing in human history has done more for social justice than science. Southeast Asia has pulled millions of people out of poverty using science. The greatest discovery in human history is science. Meanwhile, the Western world lost its dearest freedom, freedom of speech. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, according to the inscription on war memorials all over the Western world. Western governments, Western media, Western universities, Western school teachers, radical feminists, and social justice warriors relentlessly vilified the working class as racists, bigots, homophobes, intolerant, and misogynists. Free speech, the West's dearest freedom, was denied. In desperation, Europeans turned to the far right. The 4-decade vilification of the working class led to the rise of Donald Trump, Brexit, and the election of populist leaders across the West. Highly respected intellectuals feared that Europe, the US, and the entire Western world would fall into revolution. The Chinese Communist Party was revitalized under Xi Jinping. China established a worldwide string of military bases disguised as shipping ports. A worldwide GPS network, Beidou, which they integrated into half of the world's countries, tracking the movements of their vehicles and their citizens, built embassies full of microphones that sent nightly audio files to Beijing, carried out daily cyber attacks against Australian government websites and infrastructure, crippled the Indian power grid with a similar attack, deployed satellites with robotic arms and suspicious weapons, hacked websites, launched TikTok and harvested the data of millions of people across the world, harvested the DNA data of millions of people from pregnancy testing kits, and harvested the data of nearly every Western man, woman and child, and filled their own country and others with sophisticated surveillance equipment and cameras that examine each person's gait, scan big data to locate their identity, and scan their faces to read their emotions in order to further refine their social credit score. The CCP's surveillance state is far worse than any science fiction nightmare. While China's insidious worldwide influence grows, the US has elected a president so cognitively diminished he struggles to compose a sentence. Chinese intellectual property theft is so severe it's currently at $200 billion per year. The National Security Division at the Department of Justice has to open a new case every half hour. So deeply has the CCP penetrated Australia's universities, government departments and political parties that Australia's former Prime Minister Paul Keating is on the payroll of the China Development Bank, refers to China as a great state, and says Australia's intelligence agencies should be cleaned out for criticising China. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd refers to Xi Jinping as Uncle Z, as we call him. One should not show such affection for a mass murderer. 1/4 of all Australian federal politicians are lawyers. Yet the staggering growth in income inequality between 1970 and today, caused by big business corruption on a scale never before seen in history, occurred under both sides of politics. It grows ever bigger today all across Australia. It cannot be fixed by either side.
These bally old rotters have swiped our country, swiped our freedom, and swiped our children's future. It's time for a change.
Only an outsider can end the corruption and restore our glorious civilization. Let us give our children a fairer world. Let us not fail them. Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached, but rather by the obstacles he has overcome in order to succeed. Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery. I survived a childhood of horrifying violence by educating myself reading encyclopedias. Our children deserve better than the sick education system that we have. Western civilization became great when people ventured into the unknown, crossed mighty oceans and deserts, delved into the human mind or quantum physics, climbed glorious mountains, or sought to understand the universe. Western civilization declined when people traded adventure for sitting on a lounge and staring at a screen. We need to get out into the savagery, wildness, and sheer magnificence of the real world again. Helen Keller was blind and deaf, yet she achieved more than 99% of people today. Her words are the motto that all truly great people live by. Life is either a daring adventure or it is nothing at all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Cheerio.